My name is Melody Hancock, and I'm from a small community just north of Marianna, Florida, on the Florida-Georgia state line. I grew up there and didn't move out west until I was an adult. One of the things you notice about the communities where I grew up and surrounding communities is that there are a lot of churches. There's literally a church on every corner. Where I grew up, there was no stoplight, and we just had a gas station, but we had 5 or 6 churches. And the churches aren't like what you would typically think. Some of them look like the New England type churches, but many of them are small structures and small buildings, or they're in people's homes or trailers. And you know it's a church by the crosses that are out front. Also, they still have revivals there, and so people will just, the preacher will set up a tent. There's traveling preachers, and they'll set up a big tent with a sign and crosses, and people will come to those services. And so that's very different. It is predominantly Christian, and there are very few Jewish synagogues or Muslim mosques. You'd have to go to a large city like Jacksonville or Tallahassee to see those, but for the most part in the rural communities that's not there. While anybody can go to any church, predominantly there are Caucasian churches and then there are African American churches. And people tend to still to this day attend church separately. And that's a little bit different too. One of the other things that's different is the landscape. There's a lot of farming, and when you go there, there's a lot of cotton fields, miles and miles of cotton fields. The other things are miles and miles of tobacco fields too. And everywhere else in the country in farming communities, you see large silos, and that's not true in the South. We have large drying racks that are very tall, and that's used to dry the tobacco. The cotton is baled, and then the tobacco is dried. So in the farms, you don't see large silos at all. Another part of that is when you go to a community in the rural South, one of the things that you'll notice immediately is the smell. And you can smell the tobacco from miles away. And so one of the unique smells of the South, where I came from, is the smell of tobacco from that growing in the fields. Another interesting thing is that it's very wet. The ground is very wet where I grew up, and therefore graveyards look a little bit different. People are not buried underground. They're buried above ground in like cement crypts, and that's a little bit different. So when you go to a graveyard there, you see these big buildings, cement, concrete buildings that come up like this, and that people are actually buried in that, and they're not buried underground because of the wetness of the soil. Also in the homes there are no basements for the same reason, because they'll just leak. Another interesting difference with the South is that all of the houses there have an interior room. And what that means is it's a room in the middle of the house that has no windows. And that's for safety. That's the room that you go to during a hurricane. And so all the homes there have that, which is an interesting feature that you don't see really anywhere else. Another part of the South is that it's very humid. And in the summer, it's very, very hot. So here in Arizona, it might be 105 degrees, but we only have, 5% humidity. Where I grew up, it would be 90 or 100 degrees with 90% humidity. And it's very, very hot. And as a result, many of the kitchens, there are actually 2 kitchens. There's a kitchen in the house, but then there's also a kitchen that's outside of the house. And it's part of what's called a breezeway. And so the garages there are detached, and you have the main house. Between the house and the garage is a breezeway that's screened in, and there's another kitchen. So many of the homes there have 2 kitchens. Another interesting thing that's different about the South that reflects some of its history is that the houses are far apart, and the acreage is large, and part of that reason is many of these places are former plantations. So in the farming communities before the Civil War, these were plantations that were run by slave labor, and now they're large farms that have people working on them. But as a result of that, the people who live and work on the farm many of them live in former slave quarters, which is also very different. And so it's very spread out there because of that. It's still very rural, still very agricultural, and that's a remnant of the plantations. that were there before the Civil War. Also, too, because of the wetness of the soil, it's very muddy, and we have large farms and mostly dirt roads, and so people drive trucks. So almost everyone I knew owned a truck. Our family, actually, we had two trucks, and so I actually learned to drive a truck. And I actually didn't drive a car until I was a senior in college. So I grew up driving a truck. And that's what most people drive there because of the landscape and because of the needs there in the farming communities.